this morning, I realized that today is Memorial Day, and I want to acknowledge that a little bit, and how we got, or how I got, or how the thoughts got from Memorial Day to today's topic, which is learning how to think, learning how to live. And a memorial is a structure, according to the dictionary. It is a structure that is designed to cause us to remember a person, or to cause us to remember events, to memorialize them. And you see, where we live in right on the North-South Carolina border, and it may be the same all over the country, you see these little impromptu roadside memorials all up and down the highway. And unfortunately, these are places where someone has lost their life in a traffic accident. But their families come out and they erect some sort of a symbol. It may just be a bouquet of flowers, or it may be a cross, or it may be something else. But they put that up on the roadside at the very spot where their beloved died. And occasionally when you're driving down the road, you'll actually see people gathered there holding hands as if in prayer. And they're at this memorial, the structure that is designed to cause them to remember. And they are remembering that person, So Memorial Day then is about remembering. And we want to talk a little bit about what remembering is, what memory is. And of course, memory and remembering is an activity of thought. Dr. Holmes tells us that our memories are thoughts that deal with the past. They are thoughts that were once in our consciousness, they were once in our experience, but now they have gone somewhere. They've gone off into what we call memory. And they seem to come back. It's as if they go away and they're off somewhere for a while, and then they come back. Where do they go? What do they do when they're there? I love when you know that you know something and you just can't remember it. It's like your computer just won't open that file. It just won't access it. And you know it. It's on the tip of my tongue, and I just absolutely know, and we can't get it, and we're trying to make it happen. We're trying to force it. We're trying to think all these things. Well, wait a second. Now, the person whose name I'm trying to think of, they were best friends with this one over here, and maybe if I think about this one over here, I'll remember this. And no matter how hard we struggle, in fact, the harder we struggle, the less likely we are to remember it. And then we go and do something entirely different. We kind of give up on it. This is the surrender part, I think, of treatment. We kind of give up on it. And we give up on it. We begin to do something else, and there's like a flash, Our intention to know this information seemed to go somewhere, not a physical space, stirred up something, and poof, there it was. It came back to us. So Holmes tells us to consider then that memories are thoughts that were once in our consciousness, that have passed through our consciousness, that have gone off somewhere into this thing we call memory, and then have come back to us. See, just think about it that way. Just help to think about it that way. So contemplating then what memory is and what remembering is, then leads into today's topic, which is learning how to think is learning how to live. To learn how to think is to learn how to live. It's kind of a tagline or a byline of Science of Mind. You'll see it on many of the pamphlets for churches. Learn how to think, learn how to live. The tagline for the Science of Mind magazine was change your thinking, change your life. To learn how to think is to learn how to live. So we go, or at least I won't say I went, but consciousness seemed to go from this idea of What is a memorial? What is memory? What is remembering? And remembering is a process of thinking, but then what is thinking, you see? And if to learn how to think is to learn how to live, then we really need to contemplate. We really need to come to some sort of an understanding of what this whole business of thought is, what this whole business of thinking is. How do we think? How do our thoughts seem to go somewhere and then come back to us? And then from a deeper, from a spiritual level, how do our thoughts seem to interact with something in the universe, this, what we would call this power in the universe, the law of mind? You could call it the power of prayer, you could call it the Holy Spirit, the doer of the word, you can call it many different things. But people of many different ages, people of many different religions, people of no particular religion, people of self-help psychology and motivational speakers and authors, all tell us that if we direct our thinking, if we change our thinking, if we somehow can cause our thinking to stay focused on a particular line or a particular object or a particular goal or even a particular attitude. Today I'm going to be happy. Today I am happy, you know. I'm healthy, happy, and terrific was an affirmation. Today I am happy. Today I am God's living instrument of love. All of these kind of things tell us that as human beings, we have the ability to choose, freedom of will, right? All religions will tell us that we have freedom of will. And there's a downside to that, which is the cause of our pain and our suffering and that which traditional theologies call sin, right? Why did sin enter the world? You know, freedom of will, freedom of choice. That's what the metaphor of the Garden of Eden is all about, right? Adam and Eve were told not to do something, and they decided to go do it anyway. You know. No, of course, I don't believe that was an actual place in an actual time, but it is a metaphor that represents the human condition. We can choose. You and I can choose. Now, then that brings us to the really profound question. The deepest question we have to ask ourselves is, are you really choosing? Are you mindful? Right? So right now, our Wednesday night Zoom group, we're reading Thich Nhat Hanh's book on mindfulness, and the point that he's making, the point that this Buddhist teaching is making, is we go through life. You and I go through life, and we're never here. We're never here. You know, our bodies are here. Our bodies are doing something. You know, they're driving a car, for example. You know. Going down the road, driving your car, 70 miles an hour on the interstate, radio's blasted, talking on the cell phone, drinking a cup of coffee, you know. And we're just not there. We're not in the moment. We're not mindful of the moment. So we're not choosing. If we're not mindful, we can't choose. You know, the other side of that argument is we are choosing. By not exercising our ability to choose, we are choosing to accept whatever comes our way. And I want you to really think about that. We have made a choice, perhaps not consciously, but we have made a choice to accept whatever comes our way. And what's going to come our way? Well, it's what the human consciousness believes. What human consciousness believes is appropriate. So let me jump back a little bit to Memorial Day and what it is that I think that we as spiritual beings can do, or I hate to use the word should, but I think we can consider that this is something that might be of interest to us to do. If you read the email last night, I wrote in there that a few months ago, I had an opportunity to work with the local historical museum. They had put together an exhibit of the contributions that the residents of that county had made to World War I. And we were coming right up on the anniversary of the armistice, and the exhibit was supposed to come down. So I wanted to take pictures and video and do some voiceover narration and put together a little presentation so that after the exhibit was torn down, there would still be a record of it, so all of this work that the volunteers had put into putting up this exhibit wouldn't just be gone. And in doing that, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the First World War in general, and I learned a lot about the life of the people in the county at the time. But what really impressed me, what really came home, and it was saddening. It was saddening at the end of the project for me, was I really came to understand that the casualties, the people who died, the people who were injured, they weren't just statistics. So many times our leaders, our politicians, we use very, very colorful words, our heroes. I think Lincoln used the word "our honored dead." Remember our honored dead. And that just barely scratches the surface. We might say, well, there were X number of people from this county who died in this war, and of those, Y died from disease, and Z died from combat, and another group died from accident, and it doesn't scratch the surface of understanding that these were husbands and wives and fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters. These were somebody's children, somebody's co-workers, somebody's teammates. These were human beings just like you and I. And the reason that I mention that is that what if we look at the holiday, the Memorial Day holiday, and we look at the way that it's celebrated now, it's almost as if we kind of don't want to go there. We don't want to go to the sadness. We don't want to remember what this day is really all about. And yet there are people who are suffering. There are families for whom this day must be terrible, for it brings back their memories. After the First World War, what had happened is the government came back to the families who had lost their loved ones and offered to bring the remains back home to the United States. When they died there, they were buried somewhere in whatever country they died in. And the government offered to bring the remains back to the United States and inter them in a national cemetery, or if the family could afford it, if the family had money to pay the difference between bringing them home and burying the remains at a national cemetery, or shipping the body back to their hometown so it could be buried in a local church cemetery. The families that could afford to do that did that. And some of the families opted to leave their loved ones' remains in Europe. Their thinking was that's where they made their sacrifice. That's where the remains should be. And after the war, what had happened was the Gold Star mothers petitioned to Congress and said, many of these women can't afford to go to Europe to visit their sons' graves. We think the government ought to sponsor such a pilgrimage. So the government did. Congress passed an act and made funds available, and there were certain requirements that had to be met and these things. But many mothers were provided with this trip. They were given a train ticket to New York, and they put up in a hotel there, and they went on a steamship, and they crossed the ocean, and then they were treated very, very well, taken to fine restaurants and things like that, and then driven out to the cemeteries, and they were given a bouquet of flowers. And it just tore my heart up to see these pictures of these mothers kneeling at the grave that they were seeing for the first, last, and only time. And they had to go and get back on a boat, come back home. So the reason I tell you this story is I think that somehow we lose sight. When we remember, I think we somehow lose sight of what it is that we are trying to remember. I think that somehow, instead of remembering things as they actually were, we remember them as we think they were, or we want them to have been. And this is true not just in things such as Memorial Day, but it is true in our own lives, in our own memories of what we're bringing back up. Now, here's the importance of that. Here's why I think it's important to bring that up in a talk about our spirit and our soul and our union with God, is if we cannot remember things as they were, if we cannot deal with the truth, so to speak, how can we change it? How can we change it? So as I said in the opening treatment, war exists because it exists in human consciousness. It does not exist in the mind of God. We have to get that straight. The divine is omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, all presence. There is no hostility in the mind of God. There is no war in the mind of God. It is a human invention. And if you and I are to do anything to change that, we must remember the sadness of it. It is not this beautiful, glorious sacrifice that people make and the politicians have us believe. It is death. It is destruction. It is suffering. And we don't want to glorify that. What we want to do is we want to bring our consciousness to a consciousness of peace. We want to bring our consciousness to a consciousness of love. We want to include all people in that. So now we come away from this idea of Memorial Day, and we come back into our own lives, and we say, well, to learn how to think is to learn how to live. Dr. Holmes tells us that, but he's not the only one who told us that. Right? The saying over the temple at Delphi, the temple to Apollo, said, "Know thyself, know thyself." To learn how to think is to learn how to live. If we go back and look at self-help and psychology and philosophy, this idea that what the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve. When you believe it, you'll see it. All of these things are telling us that to learn how to think is to learn how to live. And one of the first places we need to learn how to think is with regards to memory, to remembering. So we have something that we call consciousness. We have something that we call our ability to think, and we really don't know what that is. I think the wisest person alive cannot explain it adequately, other than it is. It is. And the problem with that is that things that we assume everybody experiences the same way, well, they may or they may not experience it the same way. So when I talk about thinking, what works for me may not work for you at all. You may have an entirely different understanding of what I mean by thinking. It's like love, You can go all over the world, you talk about love, and everybody's eyes light up, and they smile, and their hearts get warm. But we don't know that their experience of love or what they mean by love is what we mean by love. So we have this thing called thinking. We have these things called thoughts. We have this thing called memory. And our consciousness can somehow travel in time back to the past, and we can live in the past, or we can project into the future, or we can envision a future, or we can be here now. We can be mindful. We can be present, and the present is the only place that we live. The past is gone. The future is not here. The present is now. And yet we spend most of our time flitting off to the past, or moving off to the future. And many times I'll call them the quality of the thoughts that we have, or the emotion that goes with the thoughts, the feeling nature that is prevalent, is not positive. It is not positive, right? What I mean by that is we look back at the past with regret, and we look forward to the future with worry. That's the human experience anyway. But what we have to remember is that you and I can choose. We can choose. We have free will. We have the ability to choose. So we have the ability to choose, and we have the ability to decide what we will give our attention to. And yet, if we look around us and if we look in the mirror, we will find that we as human beings spend very little time deliberately doing that. The one thing that we can do, that as far as we know, no other species can do, is the one thing that we spend the least amount of time on. Let me get a drink here. In the 7 chakra system of the East, they start off, the root chakra is about survival, the second chakra is about procreation, and the third chakra is about willpower, dominance, and control. And it's not until you get to the fourth chakra, which is the heart, you see, that this is where, in that way of thinking, this is where the spiritual nature starts to evolve. This is why in Buddhism, the symbol for the heart chakra is 2 triangles, one pointed up and one pointed down, which, by the way, gives you a 6-pointed star. And it is demonstrating that it is at what we call the heart, not the physical organ, but the function of love, the function of the heart. This is where we begin to distinguish ourselves from the rest of the things that are alive. Every animal that is alive wants to survive, needs to procreate, wants to have its way, wants to secure things. But it is when we come to the heart, when we come to love, that things start to change. And then, of course, the next 3 chakras up, creative self-expression, intuition, any experience of our unity with all life. This is where the spiritual nature is represented. So we were studying some tapes on Jewish mysticism, and it was really interesting. I got a set of tapes a friend sent me, and the teacher was kind of a hippie rabbi from the 60s in San Francisco. Really, really delightful gentleman to listen to, and he played the guitar. And he would sing folk songs. He would play the guitar, he would sing folk songs, and he would tell us about the Kabbalah. He said, in that system of teaching, right, they have a 10 chakra system, but in that system of thinking, they talk about the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, and the speaker. And he said they don't talk about the human, but they talk about the speaker, because most humans, or human consciousness, is really functioning at the same level as all other animated creatures. But it is when we begin to choose, when we begin to carefully speak our words, when we recognize that we have the ability and responsibility and accountability to choose, that's when we begin to enter the spiritual realm. To me, that represents the heart chakra. That's where we start to enter the spiritual realm. So the first thing that we want to consider about memories, right, is that memories are what were once our conscious thoughts that have gone somewhere. Now, for the sake of today's discussion, it might be very helpful if you would think about sitting in a theater and there's a screen and these thoughts are just coming across it. If you've studied EST or any other kind of teaching such as that, this is a common technique. I think Napoleon Hill might have referred to it in some of his writings. But the idea is you are the observer. You are the observer, and there's this screen, and on this screen all of these different things are appearing. Thoughts are coming, thoughts are going, things are appearing. Now, some of those things that come across the screen, they're familiar to you. Okay? You remember them. And what the feeling is that, I have experienced that. That is my memory. That is me. That is a part of me that is going across the screen. And somehow we feel an attachment to that idea. That we have a sense of reality about that idea. So you can imagine that three thoughts come across the screen, and two of them have absolutely no connection to them. You don't, they might even be in a different language than the one you speak. And then all of a sudden there's this, this picture of you in first grade. You go, there's a memory, there's a connection, right? There's a realization. So the ideas that come to us that seem familiar, these are what we call memories. But what we want to consider is that these are thoughts that were once conscious thoughts that have gone somewhere, that are now playing back to us. And our memory, right, we somehow think our memory is true. Our memory is just an opinion. Just an opinion, right? An opinion is, this is what I think about that. This is my judgment. This is my view. But an opinion is not necessarily the truth. I mean, you see that you see that today. Open your Facebook stream and you'll see the same event with 10 different opinions about what it means. So what has happened is we have experienced something in the past. We formed an opinion about it, a point of view or a judgment, and it got filed away in our memory. But the opinion or the judgment that we formed about it is not necessarily the truth. It is just the way that we perceived it at the time. And the problem that we have with memory is that every time it comes up, we assume that the opinion that we formed when we were 5 or 6 years old, well, that's the way it is. That's the truth, and that's the way it is. And of course, it may not have been the truth at all. In her work on forgiveness, Louise Hay gives us a technique to bring up a memory that may perhaps be painful, and then to consider what that same event might have looked like or felt like, or how it may have been perceived by a total stranger just walking down the street. Someone who wasn't engaged in it, someone who wasn't involved in it. And what she's doing with that is giving us an opportunity to see that there's another way. There's another way to view this. There's another way to look at it. And if my memory is something that was once in my consciousness that has gone off into this thing called memory, I can change that memory. See, I can change it. And what I'm saying is we are not bound by our past. We are not bound by it. We can understand that just like war is an outpicturing of human consciousness, but a consciousness that does not need to exist and a consciousness that can change, we can understand then that these things that we remember in the past, from the past, we can change the way that we remember them. We can change the way that they affect us. So this is very important because we are not victims of our thoughts. We are not victims of our memories. We are conscious choosers in our universe. We can decide how we will react. I was talking to somebody last week about Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he made the bold statement that even in a place like Auschwitz, he could choose his attitude. He could choose his attitude. And he went on to found logotherapy, a school of psychiatry. We have the ability to choose, but we have to accept that ability. We have to practice it. See, I think that's the key word right there. We hear it, we read it, the motivational speakers tell us about it, ministers tell us about it, teachers tell us about it, everybody tells us about it, but we have to practice it. Now, I think part of the reason that we need to understand why we don't do it is, first of all, it's difficult, right? It's painful. Sometimes it can be painful, just like going back and remembering what Memorial Day is really about. To me, it was painful. It was painful to think of the sadness that it represents. And sometimes going back and revisiting old memories is painful. So just like, the politicians and the speech makers are going to find ways to seemingly glorify the tragedy of war and to make it easier, and in so doing, they are contributing to its persistence. We have to be able to go back and deal or think about or not be afraid to acknowledge this is what came up, this is the way I feel about it, this is the feeling that was attached to it, but that's not the truth of who I am. See, I can change that. I can change that. The other thing that's interesting to me when you think about memories is they're not always true. I mean, not only is it just perhaps a perception that I had as a 5 or 6 year old child of a series of events that took place, but sometimes the things we remember just simply never happened. They never happened. Again, I'll give you an example of this from my own life. I was going somewhere in the car about a month ago, and I was heading out to the car, and I knew that I had to get gas because the gas gauge was pointing to empty the last time I looked at it. And I jumped in the car, and I put the key in the ignition, and I started up, and the gas tank went right up to full. It was full. And I was perplexed, and I said, how is that, I remember this thing pointing to empty. And I stopped, and I thought. I said, well, no, you just filled it up 2 days ago. Well, where did this idea that the gas tank is empty, where did that come from? Where did this memory come from? And what I was able to do was work it back to a dream. I had a dream the night before that I was out driving in the car, and when I put the car in the driveway, it was almost out of gas, and I said to myself in the dream, I said, well, next time I go out and start the car, the first thing I need to do is get gas. My point is that my memory was false. My memory was false. So in dealing with memories, the way that we have to deal with memories is we have to become conscious choosers today. We have to realize that a memory is a conscious thought that has gone somewhere. The conscious thought we had at the time may or may not have been true, may or may not have been the only way to look at things. And I am not bound by the past. I am not bound by memory. I have to choose this moment. That's the key message. We have to choose this moment. A memory comes up. What do I want to do with that? Oh, look, here comes a memory. What do I want to do with that? Now, here's the importance of this. Just from a pure psychological self-help point of view, that is a way of freeing us of the past. But if we continue to get caught up in the emotion of the past, of the way things were, and we think that the way things were are the way things that they have to be, we are stuck in the past and we are recreating that in the future. There's a power in the universe that responds to us exactly according to our belief, and if we believe that the way things were are the only way they can be, then that's the way they shall be for us. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to catch ourselves in the process of thinking, in the process of believing, and ask ourselves, do I really want to believe that? Excuse me, I get another drink of water. Is that the only way of looking at that? Is that the only truth? Is that the best truth? Do I accept that as true? Now, from a practical point of view, I think we have to acknowledge that even though we have been told our whole lives that we are thinking beings, and I apologize getting a tickle in my throat, we have not been taught what thinking is nor how to think. When we went to school, we were taught to memorize facts and retain them long enough to put them down on a test, but not necessarily how to think. And there's a good reason for it. The teachers didn't have time to entertain everybody's questions, or so they thought. So they just told you, here's the answer. I told you I went back to the tech college here when we first moved to Rock Hill, and I took some classes, and the teacher puts up a slide, and there's some words on the slide that are in bold and italics, and the teacher says, wink, wink, nod, nod. Those things that are bold and italicized just might be the things that are going to be on the test. That was it. For the students who were in the class that simply wanted to pass the class to move towards a degree, that's all they had to do was write down the words that were in bold and italics, memorize where they were, and they could pass the test. It was about passing a test, not learning how to think, not whether or not this fact is true was the only way of looking at it. In a similar fashion, when we were children in Sunday school or catechism class or those kind of things, we were taught that we needed to believe something simply because the people in authority told it to us. Perhaps your parents might have said, because I said so. Well, all of these things teach us not to think. And now, as adults, as the people who are responsible and accountable for our lives, we must challenge ourselves to think. We must be mindful. We must be here. We must be now. And we must come to consider, this is just a practice, right? But try it. Come to consider, come to observe thoughts as they come into your field of awareness. I think I told you I read an article about a book by Peter Carruthers, who was a philosopher or is a philosopher of consciousness. Amazing, huh? Philosopher of consciousness. What is consciousness? And he said, we say I had a thought, or we say I'm thinking of this, or I thought of that, but we really don't know what that process is. It is as if the thought just appears into our field of awareness. Now this is very, very important for us to consider from the spiritual aspect of it, is what is our intention? What is our desire? What is it that we want to know? See? So I think what happens is when people say they had a thought, there was something that they wanted to know, something that was on their mind, like trying to remember that name that we couldn't remember. And all of a sudden, it appeared. So it is intention. It is intention. Tesla said his great inventions were revelations. Einstein said imagination was more important than logic and reason. And this process that we call thought or thinking, we really don't know what it is. But it seems to be that you and I can have an intention. We can make a choice. We can set a desire. And just like our conscious thoughts go off somewhere and get stored as memory, our intention or our desire seems to go somewhere beyond the veil of what we are aware of, somewhere into that which is the subconscious, or Dr. Holmes would call mind. And it does something. Our intention does something. Our desire does something. It stirs up something, and the answer comes back to us. Now, every idea that comes across our field of consciousness is not necessarily one that has an impact on our lives, but it is the ones that we accept as true. See, it is our belief. It is our belief that is the activating force. I love, if you go into your dining room, most dining rooms, you have some kind of a dimmer switch in there to raise and lower the lights above the dining room table. And think of that dimmer switch as your level of belief. If you have absolutely no belief whatsoever, there's no light comes on, the dimmer switch is down. If you believe with your whole heart and soul, a faith so certain that anything to the opposite cannot enter, that dimmer switch is turned all the way up, the light is as bright as it can be. So pay attention to what comes into your field of consciousness. Are you accepting it as true? Or are you dismissing it as saying, not mine, not true? Here comes one, nope, not going to give that any consideration. Here comes an old memory, well, that's the way that I used to think about it. I don't have to think about it that way anymore. What about when we get to the future? Well, what is your intention? What kind of future do you want to have? We have been created and given the freedom to choose. And there is a power in the universe that responds to us according to our belief. That is what we must learn. We are not here to just simply have ideas float into our head and go, oh, that's good, I think I'll jump on that one. We are here to choose. So we must become mindful. We must become mindful. Become mindful of what thoughts are going through our heads. Become mindful of what is going on around us. Become mindful of the type of future that we are creating with our thoughts today. And we must deliberately let go, eliminate those things that we no longer want to have happen in our lives. We don't want another war so that future generations can stand on the platform on a Memorial Day and somehow try to justify what was done. We don't want to spend any more of our lives being controlled by our past. We want to recognize that whatever memories we have, we can change. They're over. They're done. They're just ideas. They're old ideas coming back to us in the now, and in the now we can change them. And then we want to realize that the future, see, tomorrow is being created today. Today is the tomorrow we created yesterday. We want to recognize that if we are mindful today of what we are creating by what we are choosing to believe in, then we don't need to worry about the future. Because the future is being created by our thoughts and our beliefs today. This is why learning to meditate, this is why a technique such as mindfulness is so powerful. We must practice. We must become the speaker in our lives. We must put to use that ability, that God-given ability that we have to be aware, to choose, to decide, to believe. Perhaps the most important part of all of that is there's nobody who's going to do it for you. There's nobody who can do it for you. You are the only thinker in your universe. What is thinking? What are thoughts? Am I the one thinking the thought, or am I the one observing the thought? Is my intention a thought that I think? Does my intention cause something to happen? Cause the ideas that are associated with what I want to have happen to come back to me so I can observe them? These are deep questions. We're not going to answer them in one Sunday. But these are the questions of life. To learn how to think is to learn how to live. And I invite you this week, I invite you this holiday weekend, to consider what is it that we are truly trying to remember. And what we are truly trying to remember, I'm going to suggest, is that we are spiritual beings living in a spiritual universe where the thoughts that we believe in, the things that we believe to be true, have power, create our lives, create our attitude, create our experience. And we have dominion over those thoughts. But having dominion and exercising dominion through practice are two different things. Take some time this week to remember. Remember where we come from, the unity, the singularity, the oneness. Remember that our entire life is up to us by choosing what to remember, what to think, what to believe, what to create. Practice setting your intention and seeing what ideas come back to you. Practice sitting in your chair and seeing that movie screen in front of you and just observe thoughts as they come and go and say, I want this one, or I don't want that one, I'd rather see another one. Set your intention and see what happens. Holmes said probably the greatest discovery we ever made was that we could think, that there's this thing called mind, that we have thoughts and they go somewhere and something acts upon them. To learn how to think is to learn how to live. Explore this aspect of your being that we take so much for granted. And so it is.